Good morning. Let's start by thinking back to 2023.
Okay.
Finland, after decades of strict military non-alignment, officially joined NATO. They essentially chose to step safely under America's nuclear umbrella.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. A huge historic shift.
It was. But now, fast forward to today, Finland is actively preparing legislative changes to potentially host nuclear weapons on its own soil.
Which is wild when you think about it.
Yeah, what changed in just 3 years? Well, the answer isn't simply sitting in Moscow. The catalyst for this dramatic shift is actually 4,000 kilometers away, down in the Indian Ocean.
It really is a perfect example of how interconnected the modern threat landscape has actually become.
Exactly. So welcome to the Strategic Overview. If you are joining us today, you know our mission. We are here to deliver an objective, clear, and comprehensive analysis of the current events shaping our world.
Yeah, we're bringing you the facts, looking at different courses of action, and maintaining strict neutrality.
Right. Our goal isn't to generate fear, but to foster a clear-eyed, professional understanding of a highly complex geopolitical landscape. This deep dive is brought to you by our sponsor, ProWave AI.
And of course, the briefing you are about to hear is generated by Stylo News, the AI-powered news application.
To clearly establish the parameters for today's briefing for you, the listener, title, Europe's Strategic Outlook, NATO Friction, Russia Pressure, Iran Spillover, Region, Europe, date 7 April 2026.
And just to give you some brief context on the tool making this analysis possible, Stylo News is actually the consumer version of the Stylo Intel Ops software.
Right, which was originally engineered for complex enterprise operations across government, military, business sectors, all of that.
Exactly. So what that means for you is that you are getting unique, direct access to the exact caliber of analytical synthesis designed to support global decision makers.
It's pretty incredible. So today we have a very clear through line. We are examining the cascading effects of the Middle East conflict on NATO's internal cohesion.
And how Russia is exploiting that specific distraction to apply hybrid pressure across Northern Europe.
Yeah, and finally, we'll analyze how European nations are rapidly transforming their domestic defense industries in response to all this. Okay, let's unpack this.
It's a critical moment, really. I mean, we're witnessing a classic high-stakes example of geopolitical spillover.
Right.
Actions in one theater, the Middle East, are immediately stress-testing the foundational security architectures of another, being Europe.
So let's start with the catalyst. On March 20th, 2026, we saw a massive trigger event. Iran demonstrated a new expanded ballistic missile range of approximately 4,000 kilometers.
Which is a huge jump.
It is. And they did this by targeting the joint U.S.-UK military base on Diego Garcia.
Right, way out in the Indian Ocean.
Exactly. Now, when you look at a map, a 4,000-kilometer radius changes the geopolitical math instantly. It technically places parts of southeastern Europe directly under potential threat.
Precisely. And the immediate concern for NATO decision-makers there is Kosovo. Yeah, because Kosovo currently hosts NATO's KF-4 peacekeeping mission, as well as Camp Bondsteel.
Ah, right. And for those who don't know, Camp Bondsteel is the largest U.S. military base in the Balkans.
Right, and we have to clarify why Bondsteel matters so much. It isn't just a logistics hub, you know.
No, it's a massive physical symbol of the American security commitment in Europe.
Exactly. If that base is suddenly within the threat radius of an Iranian missile, the European theater is just no longer insulated from the Middle East.
And we have to layer the economic reality right on top of that military threat, don't we?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Because simultaneously, there's an effective blockade of the Strait of Hormuz going on.
Right. And you can think of the strait as the world's energy jugular vein. It controls roughly 20% of the world's oil transit.
And that disruption is choking off supply, which is directly driving up global energy prices.
Which means the average European listener isn't just, reading about missile ranges online. They are feeling it at the gas pump and the grocery store.
Exactly. It feeds directly into immediate inflationary pressures across Europe. We are also tracking massive supply chain disruptions in commodity markets.
Like aluminum, right?
Yeah, notably aluminum. So European capitals are staring down a dual crisis, a newly expanded military threat and immediate severe economic pain.
And this is where the transatlantic rift violently breaks open, because the U.S. administration, led by President Trump, didn't just absorb this tension.
No, they certainly didn't.
They launched military strikes against Iran without prior consultation with NATO allies.
Right. And following those unilateral strikes, Washington is now demanding that European nations provide naval support in the Middle East.
Basically to secure those maritime transit routes, right?
Yeah. If we connect this to the bigger picture, The perspectives between Washington and Europe are just entirely opposed right now.
Well, from the United States perspective, there is deep systemic frustration. The administration feels they are overwhelmingly shouldering the financial and military burden of global security.
Right. And they have publicly labeled European allies as, quote, paper tigers for their reluctance to assist.
Which is strong language. Senior U.S. officials are actively pushing what they call a beneficiary pays principle.
Yeah, essentially, President Trump has explicitly threatened to withdraw from NATO, or at least drastically reduce U.S. commitments if Europe doesn't step up and reciprocate in the Middle East.
But look at the European perspective. Leaders from France, Germany, the UK, and Spain have just flatly declined to engage militarily.
Yeah, their stated priorities are diplomatic solutions.
Yeah.
Furthermore, they are dealing with intense domestic political constraints.
Right, their populations are exhausted by inflation.
Exactly. And fundamentally, these governments just resist being drawn into what they consider out-of-area conflicts.
Let me put this in an analogy for you, the listener. It's as if a neighborhood watch was formed to protect one specific street, right? And now the founder is threatening to quit because the other members won't help patrol a completely different town.
That's a really good way to frame it.
So let me ask you, does this mean the fundamental Article 5 collective defense principle is actually at risk of failing? Or is this just, high-stakes transactional diplomacy?
Well, what's fascinating here is the consensus among international analysts and even Russian observers, actually.
Oh, really?
Yeah, a formal legal withdrawal of the United States from NATO is viewed as highly unlikely, mostly due to strict constraints from the U.S. Congress.
Right. Okay.
However, the mechanism of the threat is what matters.
Mm.
The rhetoric alone is incredibly effective.
How so? Like, what is it actually doing?
It is successfully shifting the burden of defense. We are witnessing a jarring transition right now. We are moving from an era of unconditional alliances, like the classic Cold War model,
Right.
to a highly transactional global security environment. The mere threat of U.S. withdrawal forces Europe to realize that the American security umbrella is no longer a guarantee.
And that single realization changes the calculus in every single European capital.
Exactly.
So while Washington and Western Europe are locked in this high-stakes staring contest over the Middle East, you have frontline states realizing the bouncer has essentially left the front door unguarded.
Yeah, and Moscow is fully aware of this distraction.
Which seamlessly brings us to Northern Europe, Poland, the Baltics, and the Nordics. The intelligence assessment for this specific region is highly nuanced right now, isn't it?
It is. The threat of an imminent large-scale conventional Russian attack, tanks rolling across a NATO border, is currently assessed as low to moderate.
Okay, low to moderate. But the threat of hybrid warfare is assessed as high. Let's make sure we clearly define that for our listeners. What is the actual mechanism of hybrid pressure?
Yeah, it's a term thrown around a lot. Hybrid pressure is a persistent, deniable campaign that deliberately operates just below the threshold of open war.
So not enough to trigger Article 5.
Exactly. It's designed to exhaust an adversary and probe for weaknesses without triggering a full military response.
So what does that look like on the ground today?
It looks like heightened cyber operations, targeting civilian infrastructure, widespread electronic warfare, like GPS jamming that disrupts commercial flights.
Right, we've seen a lot of that. And coordinated disinformation campaigns, I imagine.
Always. And we are seeing physical indicators, too. The sources point to the recent discovery of an unmanned drone in Pericola, Finland.
Wow. Whether that was a direct, aggressive incursion or just an intelligence gathering tool that crashed, it immediately triggers public panic.
Oh, absolutely. And Russian state rhetoric acts as an amplifier for these physical probes. They consistently highlight specific, highly vulnerable regional flashpoints to maintain psychological pressure.
Let's talk about the geography of those flashpoints, because the map really explains the anxiety here.
It really does.
The intelligence highlights the Suwałki corridor. For you listening, that is a tiny 40-mile strip of land that connects Poland and Lithuania.
A major choke point.
Yeah. To its west is Kaliningrad, a heavily militarized Russian exclave. To its east is Belarus, a Russian ally. If Russia were to somehow close that 40-mile gap, they would physically sever the Baltic states from the rest of NATO.
Which is exactly why a single drone flying anywhere near that region sets off massive alarm bells.
And that geographical vulnerability explains the historic policy shifts we are seeing. Like we mentioned at the top, Finland, a new NATO member, is preparing legislative changes to allow the deployment of nuclear weapons on its soil.
Right.
So I have to challenge you on this. Given that the intelligence says a conventional attack is unlikely right now, is Finland's move to allow nuclear weapons a dangerous overreaction? Like, might it provoke Russia, or is it a necessary deterrent in a newly fractured alliance?
Well, if we look at the broader pattern, it's really about deterrence through self-reliance. Finland's action is not happening in a vacuum.
What else are we seeing?
Look at Sweden. They are simultaneously making massive financial investments in advanced anti-drone defense systems.
Yeah.
What this illustrates is that frontline states feel incredibly exposed.
Right.
They are watching the friction between the U.S. and Western Europe, and they realize they can no longer rely entirely on the traditional U.S. security umbrella.
So they are taking unilateral or at least regional steps to harden their own borders.
Exactly. Russia is currently heavily committed with its conventional forces in Ukraine. So Moscow relies on these hybrid tools to test NATO's resolve and exploit any perceived political weakness.
So the nuclear legislation is basically a signal.
Yes, Finland's nuclear legislation is a signal. It's about raising the cost of any potential Russian aggression, conventional or hybrid, on an absolutely unacceptable level, regardless of what Washington does.
That makes sense. And that brings us to our third core topic, this sudden, stark realization that Europe must literally build the capacity to defend itself.
Yeah, it is causing massive domestic ripples across the entire continent.
It's deeply fragmenting domestic politics. But surprisingly, it is also triggering a massive industrial boom.
Yeah.
Let's examine the political fragmentation first as neutral reporters because it's directly impacting how the European Union operates.
The divides are very deep, and they are almost entirely driven by domestic survival. Let's look at Hungary, for instance.
Okay.
Prime Minister Viktor Orban is currently blocking the European Union's 20th sanctions package against Russia.
And Ukraine-related EU credits, right?
Yes. And to be clear on the perspectives here, Orban's stated position is that he is prioritizing Hungary's national economic interests and energy security over EU consensus.
He argues the sanctions hurt Europe more than Russia.
Exactly. And this is creating major friction with leaders like Poland's Prime Minister Donald Tusk, who strongly opposes Orban's stance.
Right. Tusk argues that robust, uncompromising support for Ukraine is essential for Europe's survival.
And these internal divisions are incredibly sensitive to the calendar. Hungary has parliamentary elections approaching on April 12, 2026.
Which will be a major watch point.
Absolutely, as it could dictate the immediate future of EU cohesion on sanctions.
We are seeing similar tectonic shifts in Germany, too. Tino Kruppala, a prominent leader of the right-wing AfD party, is actively calling for the complete withdrawal of the roughly 40,000 U.S. troops currently stationed in Germany by the year 2029.
Yeah, the AfD's position is rooted in the argument that Germany needs to pursue a strictly independent foreign policy.
Free from what they view as entanglement in international conflicts driven by the United States.
Right.
Now, you might be hearing all this and thinking, wait, the EU is arguing over sanctions and German politicians want the U.S. military to leave. It sounds like total disarray.
It does sound like that, yeah.
But here's where it gets really interesting. Despite these deep, very public political fractures over how to handle Washington or Moscow, there is a broad, undeniable consensus across Europe on one specific issue.
Rearmament.
Yes, the defense industry is experiencing an absolute renaissance.
It really is. Let's look at the mechanism of this shift. Take Romania, for example. The state-owned company Romero recently signed a partnership with a tech startup called Robotics Industries.
And their stated goal is to produce up to 1,500 drones monthly, isn't it?
Yeah, 1,500 a month. That is a profound strategic pivot.
Because Romania is fundamentally transitioning from being a consumer of military goods, buying American or French equipment, to becoming a domestic producer and a potential exporter.
Exactly. And we see this replicated across the continent. In the Czech Republic, the Czechoslovak group is reporting explosive growth.
Wow.
They are rapidly expanding their manufacturing footprint to supply European militaries and fulfill the ongoing needs in Ukraine. It's a complete industrial mobilization.
We're also seeing a fascinating demographic shift driving this. The intelligence highlights individuals like German reservist Leokady Reimers.
Right. She represents an entirely new generation of European professionals.
Yeah, they're seamlessly blending traditional military service with private sector defense tech innovation.
Specifically focusing on fields like artificial intelligence and autonomous systems.
It's essentially a Silicon Valley approach applied to European border defense.
It is. And if we pull back and look at what all these industrial and demographic trends mean, the overarching theme is Europe actively striving for strategic autonomy.
Break that down for us. What does strategic autonomy actually mean in this context?
Sure. Strategic autonomy is the geopolitical concept of a region developing the industrial capacity, the military capability, and the political will to act independently in matters of defense and security.
So not having to ask Washington for permission or for weapons in a crisis.
Exactly. The new factory partnerships, the blending of tech and defense, the massive increases in defense budgets.
Which jumped 20% among NATO members last year alone, by the way.
Right. These are the tangible, physical building blocks of that autonomy.
So we've looked at the military, the geography, and the industry. Let's turn our attention to the public sphere to see how these massive strategic shifts are actually landing with the populations involved.
The sentiment analysis is really telling here.
Yeah, when we look at the social media landscape, tracking sentiment across tags like #NATO, #Europe Defense, and #Middle East Conflict, the overall mood is highly polarized.
The data shows a deep, deep well of anxiety.
Absolutely. People are deeply concerned about the rising inflation directly tied to those energy disruptions in the Middle East.
And you also see a lot of apprehension regarding the unilateral military actions taken by the U.S.
Yeah, there is a very real fear among European citizens of being dragged into a broader out-of-area conflict that they simply didn't start.
But importantly, alongside that economic anxiety, the data shows a growing, highly supportive sentiment across Europe for increased domestic defense spending.
Which ties right back into what we were just talking about.
Exactly. The concept of strategic autonomy isn't just an abstract idea debated in parliaments anymore. It is gaining real traction in public discourse.
The realization that Europe must be self-reliant is taking root at the citizen level.
It really is.
So, based on all of these intersecting factors, the Middle East spillover, the Russian probing, the industrial boom, what are the specific courses of action decision makers are preparing for?
Well, decision makers are tracking 4 critical watch points on the horizon that listeners should keep an eye on.
Okay, let's hear them.
First, as we mentioned earlier, the April 12 Hungarian elections. The results there will directly dictate the immediate future of the European Union's sanctions regime against Russia.
Right. And second on the calendar.
Second is May 2026. Bosnia and Herzegovina is expected to sign a major acquisition agreement for Turkish Bayraktar TB2 drones.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, this is a very strong signal of further regional military modernization in the Balkans. And it points to increasing defense ties with Turkey outside of traditional Western European channels.
And looking toward the summer, we have a pivotal diplomatic event, don't we?
We do. The third watch point is July 2026. There's a crucial NATO summit scheduled in Ankara, Turkey.
Okay.
This will be the venue where the alliance has to formally and publicly address the elephant in the room.
The burden-sharing debates.
The burden sharing, the long-term reliability of the U.S. commitment under the current administration, and, of course, the strategic implications of the Iran spillover.
Right. And the final watch point.
The overall trajectory of the war in Ukraine. Researchers, such as Finland's Tyne Karjalainen, are consistently warning about the consequences of diminishing Western support.
Because as pressure mounts on Kyiv, we can expect diplomatic pushes for alternative security guarantees to dramatically intensify.
Exactly. If formal NATO membership remains stalled, we will likely see controversial discussions regarding bilateral nuclear options or regional defense pacts become much more public.
It's a lot to keep track of. As we conclude today's strategic briefing, we want to ensure you have the tools to track these rapidly evolving situations yourself, exactly as the decision makers do.
Because things are moving fast.
They really are. Today's deep dive was generated by Stylo News. For those unaware, Stylo News is a mobile and computer application that allows individuals to download and customize their own personal intelligence-style briefs.
It draws from hundreds of verified, traditional news sources, as well as real-time updates from X.
Yeah, and it synthesizes all that noise into clear, actionable insights. Subscribe to Stylo News to get AI-powered news on demand by visiting www.stylonews.com. That's www.stylonews.com.
Highly recommend checking it out.
And, on a personal note, dropping the anchor persona for a moment here, thank you so much for spending your time with us today.
Yes.
We know it's a remarkably complex and sometimes overwhelming world out there, and we genuinely appreciate you trusting us to help you navigate it.
Absolutely.
Please feel free to request topics for future deep dives, and be sure to follow Stylo News on your favorite social media platforms to stay informed.
And as we continue to monitor these daily developments, I want to leave you with one final question to ponder.
What's that?
If the current friction with Washington ultimately forces Europe to achieve full strategic autonomy, if they successfully build a massive, independent military-industrial complex and no longer need American protection, what happens to the global balance of power a decade from now, when the United States is no longer the sole, unquestioned security guarantor of the Western world?